and thank you to all of you. Thank you to everyone who's spoken so far. Thank you to the organisers, particularly to Yoram Hatzoni, for the invitation to be here today. Maybe I could start by mentioning, by the way, this is the second time I've been in Rome in a few weeks, and I mention this not so much as for a laugh line as simply for a statement that nevertheless requires noting. I got here yesterday from Heathrow Airport and arrived in Rome, as I've done many times before, and nothing happened. I got on my plane at Heathrow, as I've got on planes for years, and I landed in Rome, as I've been lucky enough to do for years. I was allowed out of the UK, and I was allowed into Italy. I say this because we have been told in Britain for 3.5 years that such events were unimaginable if we were to leave the European Union. And this, at any rate, to me, is a source of, among other things, great sadness, because there's an opportunity cost to a population having to suck up lies for such a long time. There's an opportunity cost, I would say, to people speaking lies like that for such a long time as well, but I'll park that for the time being. A second observation, on the weekend I was lucky enough to be invited to a private viewing at the Royal Academy in London on Piccadilly for the new Picasso on Paper exhibition. This, again, is one of the things that we were told would not be possible once we'd left the European Union. We wouldn't be allowed to enjoy European art, for instance. We would have to return to art pre-Picasso if we were going to enjoy art. Museums would not be lending us art, and yet there I was in the Royal Academy at the most magnificent exhibition of work from throughout Picasso's career, lent by museums from around the world and across Europe. I mention this simply because so often it's worth pointing out the things that haven't happened, the dogs that didn't bark, and I wanted to start by noting that. Now, let me next get on to the fact that now, as a Brit, and one of the only British speakers here, inevitably now I find myself at slight odds with some of the content that's already gone ahead, and Yoram knows this. I'm not a nationalist myself. I never described myself as one, and so it's always slightly strange to stand on a podium where you agree with about two-thirds or so of the logo, but nevertheless I admire many of the people who have spoken and much of the content already. But perhaps I could say then that I retain a sort of two cheers for nationalism for reasons that I'd like to just elucidate for a moment. It seems to me that there's much that one can tell in this from tonal issues. One way to think about this, it seems to me, is to say that nationalism in America sounds different from nationalism in Europe. Nationalism in Europe sounds different, feels different to nationalism in Britain. And I mention this because I'm particularly thinking of something that one speaker said earlier. I don't think it is the case, and I would certainly urge people not to regard it as the case, that, for instance, we can just sort of get over the 20th century and that we have to get beyond it. It's an enormous temptation of the political left to try to play that game. They tried to play it very recently in my own country, where they tried to pretend that there basically are no bogeymen to the left, and that you keep running left and left and left, and it's fine all the way, and you never get to the gulag. And it's just not the case. And it's such a damn lie, everyone knows it. But I think it's disingenuous for the political right not to concede the fact that there are things to our own right which we also have to contend with. It isn't the case that we can just get over the 20th century. And many of us in countries like Britain simply think that we oughtn't to take such a view, among other things, because of the risk of repeating it. Now, of course, this throws up the problem which is perennially on my mind and will be on many of yours, of how to work out a way through Europe at this moment. And I would just say this: there is one conundrum in particular that's always on my mind here. On continental Europe, it seems to me, most of the old parties are in some ways historically compromised. That all across the continent there are parties that have histories of collaborationism and lots more. And, of course, there is the problem of new parties. New parties are suspect. But this keeps us in this incredibly uncomfortable and, I think, impossible situation where old parties are a problem and the new parties are a problem. What are we meant to do? I don't know, other than to keep as strong a headlights as we can as we go ahead, knowing, as Yoram has said, that nationalism can go wrong, but knowing also that everything can go wrong. Love can go wrong. Love caused the Trojan Wars, but nobody yet has advocated its cessation. I would further say that there's an awkwardness being British speaking about these things in Europe now because, and I think one other speaker mentioned this earlier, there is an instinctive problem for conservatives in contending with these issues because the left has one great advantage over us, and the left's advantage over us is that it always wants exactly the same things in exactly the same order in exactly every country. And the right does not, and we all know that the conservation of things is different in different countries. A British conservative is necessarily defending and conserving different things to a conservative in France, is conserving different things to a conservative in Italy, and they are conserving different things from people in Scandinavia, where everyone's conserving different things in countries that to the outside look remarkably similar, but within inside, of course, have very important differences and distinctions between them. Now, I happen to be rather suspicious of analyzing trends in politics. I think that it leads to very easy thinking and simplistic thinking. We've had one in recent years with the motif of so-called populism. Populism is, among other things, a euphemism for popular, that is, elected, and this, too, seems to me a pretty unsustainable position. I'm still waiting to hear a legitimate definition of populism that's used in the pejorative way that it's been used in recent years. But I'll come on to that. Now, clearly, however, despite expressing my reservations about analyzing great trends, nevertheless, clearly something has happened in recent years, and 2016 is seen, I think, legitimately as a pivotal year in that because of the two major votes in America and Britain. By the way, I should mention that Trump supporters are always very pleased to twin their success of their candidate with Brexit, and the opposite is very rarely true, which is itself is a very interesting phenomenon. Brexiteers, generally speaking, don't particularly want to be caught up in the Trump thing, whatever that is, and they don't feel that it is part of some vast international movement, simply something that we had, that we needed to address ourselves. However, as one of the earlier speakers from France mentioned, there is this trend that Monsieur Macron recently indulged in that's been going on for some decades now, whereby the leaders of Europe basically distance themselves from the countries that they run or aspire to run. They say, for instance, that their countries have never done anything very good in the world, or they say that their national identity does not exist. And this is clearly an overreach by them. An overreach, not least, it happened again in Britain the other day. On Brexit Day, the BBC pushed out a children's programme that was making fun of the idea that there's any such thing as anything British. It said absolutely everything British is from abroad. Tea is Indian, as if we didn't know that. Sugar turns out not to come from Wales. And a whole set of other sort of straw man points. And what this BBC programme was saying was, look at you silly, awful rube Brits who think you've done anything good. And it's said entirely in that tone of vengeance and correction, and it's deeply unfair. We know, among other things, the British public, like publics across Europe, know that we have a culture which has been influenced from a massive number of other cultures. Nobody is unaware of that. But to pretend as a result that British culture doesn't exist, or French culture doesn't exist, or anything else, is like pretending that steel does not exist. Steel is not just found in its natural state in the ground. it comes from a composite. It is work that is required to create it, and yet it is there. We see it. It holds up bridges. We couldn't do without it. So to my mind, the vote of 2016 in the UK in particular is a correction to this overreach by figures such as those who have run European countries rather, in recent years. Now, I've been asked to say a few words about the Brexit phenomenon, and let me start by saying, although I'm a supporter of Brexit, voted for Brexit, I've advocated it like John O'Sullivan for as long as I've been writing, although not as long as John O'Sullivan, of course. I do think of a wonderful essay of Montaigne's, some of you will know, called How We Weep and Laugh at the Same Time. It's a remarkable essay, and he quotes Petrarch, Sonnet 81, where Petrarch reflects on the Count de Montfort's reaction after his defeat of Charles de Blois, who was his rival for the Duchy of Brittany. And Petrarch writes there, I won't give you my Italian rendering of it, but Petrarch writes, "Thus does the mind cloak every passion with its opposite, our faces showing now joy, now sadness." Let me say that how we weep and laugh at the same time isn't a bad way to approach the events of recent years. So let me first of all say what some of the sadnesses are to do with the Brexit vote, even speaking, as I say, obviously as a Brexiteer. The first is that obviously Brexit is to some degree a demonstration of failure. In the eyes of those of us who are supporters of it, that failure is primarily, in our view, a failure on the part of the EU to prove itself sufficiently adaptable to retain us within its ranks. However, there are people who will make that accusation the other way around. But it seems to me a legitimate complaint that the direction in which the EU declared itself as going, in particular ever closer union, was just not something which the British were willing to go along with. It may be right for you, and I stress that, I would re-stress that, it may be right for you. It's not, I think, the role of Britain once it's out of the EU to tell other countries what you should or should not be doing. But whatever your own relations with it, it's been clear for at least, I would say, 30 years, certainly since Maastricht, that it just wasn't right for us. But that is a source, I think, of some sadness. Another source of sadness is the fact that during the 2016 debate, I was struck by one thing in particular, which were the appeals to us in Britain from our European counterparts. A source of sadness because it doesn't behove something good. I was told repeatedly, debating and discussing in private and public with European counterparts, I was told by people in the countries in the south, in the Mediterranean countries, you've got to stay in because you can't leave us with the north. I was told by people from the north that you've got to stay in because you can't leave us with the south. I was told by people from Eastern Europe, you have to stay in because you can't leave us with the west. And I was told repeatedly from people in Western Europe, you can't leave us with these madmen in the East. Now, that was a source of some eyebrow raising at the time, but it did expose and does expose an ongoing problem, and one that I don't, I have to say, relish. There is another sadness that's worth highlighting, and particularly for anyone here, and there are some, I think, who do regret our exit from the European Union. I regret the interpretation that some of our friends on the continent put on our vote, and I think not enough has been noted of this. I know many people across Europe, many of whom are skeptical of the EU, many of whom are skeptical of all sorts of things, and indeed everything. But people who did interpret our vote in, I think, the wrong way. People who thought that, for instance, we voted the way we did because we didn't want European citizens to be in Britain, or people who thought it was an expression of dislike of our friends and brothers and sisters across the continent. Now, it seems to me it's not enough just to say and to reiterate that that isn't the point, but to prove in the years ahead that it is not the point. Many people have very dishonestly misrepresented the actions of my country in recent years, but that was never one of them. And I think for all of the people who felt that this was in some way an insult or a pushing away to our friends across Europe, I hope that in the years ahead, all of us can prove that that was not the case. Another source of regret, and I will get on to the sources of joy, don't worry, but another source of regret is that the British people have been so persistently misrepresented in recent years. I think it's fair to say that if you were to read the German press, or the American press actually, you would get an entirely fallacious view of the British public, the British people, and why we voted the way that we did. We've even seen the phenomenon of an incredibly base form of analysis which has been promulgated, I think most notably by the New York Times, which says that Boris Johnson is exactly the same as Donald Trump, and its analysis runs very little deeper than both of them have wacky hair. I cannot stress enough how pitiful this is, that at a time when we need to understand each other deeply, when we need to reconcile ourselves to very significant problems that still lie ahead, that major newspapers would still pump out analysis of such incredible shallowness. In the New York Times, we've recently learned that in Britain, until only a few years ago, we ate nothing much but mutton. Readers of the New York Times could learn that one of the major areas in the centre of London was a place called Mayfield, and we could learn day in, day out quite how racist and appalling the British people are, most recently by the New York Times giving its main opinion page, which I read in the international edition on the way over yesterday, to a famous Leninist. So that is, as I say, one other source of sadness, the conspiracy theories which we've had pumped around, conspiracy theories which are not entirely alien to some people in this hall. The claim, for instance, that we did not vote the way we did because we were unhappy with the settlement in the European Union since at least Maastricht, but we voted the way we did either because we're racist or xenophobic or homophobic or misogynist, they can do anything, but also because, for instance, we had been manipulated by Russia, or that the Poles had been manipulated, or that something else had happened, and there were dark arts, and that the British people hadn't just been unhappy with the European Union for decades, but we'd been perfectly happy until a few Russian bots suddenly got into our mother's Twitter accounts, and hey, we voted to leave. And this is a source of sadness, because anyone who wants the European Union to succeed, and indeed anyone who wants the people of Europe to succeed, you would have thought would try to contend with arguments at their most serious. And the argument that the British people had at its most serious is worth contending with. And I'll get on to it in a moment. But let me just, before that, say one other quick thing on that, which is that our vote has, and again this is a source of sadness, exposed a quite amazing, spiteful duplicity in people who one had expected better of. At the weekend, Donald Tusk urged the breakup of my country, the United Kingdom. The European Parliament managed, the night after we left the European Union, to run a massive light campaign on one of the buildings in Strasbourg, urging Scotland to come into the European Union, which is, of course, to ask Scotland to vote again. And by the way, there was a plebiscite 4 years ago, and the Scottish people voted to remain in the United Kingdom. It is not for Brussels to tell the British people who should be allowed to be British. It is... And it seems to me quite remarkable that somebody like Tusk, and indeed other people who have recently been in prominent positions or who are still, could think that that is their task. If we are going to get on in the years ahead, and we will have to and we should, that is exactly the sort of thing that will have to stop. Now, I said I would get on to some of the joys. The first is this, and this is scoffed at by all sorts of people and publications, but it is simply the significance of the return of our sovereignty as a nation. Many people have pretended that the British people do not understand the concept of sovereignty, that it is something so abstract that only a professor or somebody with a PhD could possibly understand this concept, and that it is beyond the people. And I can only tell you, and the poll evidence supports this, the British people understood very distinctly the significance of sovereignty. Now, Tony Benn, the late Labour politician, who I don't often quote with praise, nevertheless, who was an early Eurosceptic, had a very useful shorthand for this. Tony Benn used to say there were 5 questions that he always asked people in power. The first was, what power have you got? The second was, where did you get it from? The third, in whose interests do you exercise it? The fourth, to whom are you accountable? And the fifth, how can we get rid of you? Now, as it happened, I should mention, when Tony Benn met Saddam Hussein, he'd asked none of those questions, but this is a detail of history that but these are very useful questions, and the last of those in particular, how can we get rid of you, was simply a question that the British people no longer believed that they were given an honest answer to. They didn't know who governed them. They were uncomfortable. We were uncomfortable with the manner in which we were governed. We were uncomfortable with the ideas of where the laws were made, and we were uncomfortable with the idea that we could hold to account those people who made those laws if they were bad. In the same issue of the New York Times I read on the plane yesterday, I read a sob story about an MEP called Claude Moraes. The New York Times covered the fact that he has been in the European Parliament for just over 2 decades. He's been on many committees. He's also been a vice president of the Parliament's centre-left grouping. And the piece covered the tragedy of the fact that Claude Moraes was having to pack up his office in Brussels. His papers were going into boxes, doubtless to be filed in a university and be pored over by generations of students in the years to come. And he also had a beautiful view from his office, which he would no longer be able to enjoy. And this was all presented in the manner of a sob story. I, at any rate, made a little punch of the air on the plane. And this was because I do not believe that if you seized 1 million people and asked them in Britain if they'd ever heard of Claude Moraes, one of their MEPs, I don't think 1 in a million could say they had heard of him. And if you did find of them, it would be one of the little Moraes children or something. And you see, I think this is absolutely emblematic of the problem. We didn't know how to get rid of these people. We didn't know who they were. And so, in some very beautiful way, the levers of our democracy have come back to us. It doesn't mean, of course, that it'll all be brilliant. It could well go wrong. Everything always can. But at least we know where the levers of our democracy now are. Another point of joy, I would say, is the reassertion of our national consensus over Brexit in the way that it is a healthy value. Now, I stress this again. Britain and the detractors of Brexit always, I think, fail to deal with this. Britain is a remarkable country in many ways, but in one way in particular it's worth highlighting. We have never had a far-right political party, not just anywhere near power, but even in Parliament. It has not happened. All across Europe, we have the fears, there are actual far-right parties, and there are parties that are accused of being far-right. But in Britain, not one person who is far-right has ever even made it to Parliament. Why? I would say, among other things, it's because we take seriously, in things like the Brexit vote, the idea that the people should have a say in how they are governed, and do not allow resentments to fester and build until they blow out of the side in a volcanic eruption. And I think that that fact is another one that we have a right to be proud of in Britain. We've been proud of the fact that we recently saw off a far-left contender for the British Prime Ministership and British government, a contender who reminded us that anti-Semitism and racism are by no means the preserve of the far right, but can be indulged in and indeed welcomed by the far left just as easily. And I would say that it's important to remember that Brexit is a reasonable expression of nationalism in the way I would reframe it in the British sense, which is simply in the means of patriotism. Roger Scruton, who was mentioned earlier and who's on much of our minds, wrote in what was one of his last books, as it turned out, "For ordinary people living in free association with their neighbours, the nation means simply the historical identity and continuing allegiance that unites them in the body politic. It is the first-person plural of settlement. Sentiments of national identity may be inflamed by war, civil agitation, and ideology, and this inflammation admits of many degrees, but in their normal form, these sentiments are not just peaceful in themselves, but a form of peace in others. And Scruton points out that the virtues and also the flaws of the religious model of we, for when it comes to the matter of law, for instance, he says secular law adapts, religious law endures. When God makes the laws become as mysterious as God is. When we make the laws and make them for our purposes, we can be certain what they mean. The only question then is, who are we? And in modern conditions, he finishes, the nation is the answer to that question, an answer without which we are all at sea. Now, we in Britain have, broadly speaking, thought of ourselves, and think of ourselves still, as largely a force for good in the world. We are buffeted, as everyone is, by the stories of self-hatred. We are buffeted, as everyone else is by the worst aspects of our history. But by and large, the British people, and the Brexit vote is a fine demonstration of this, think that we have been more a force for good in the world than a force for ill, and have not wanted to listen to those people who've tried to contend maliciously otherwise. But none of it is new. As I draw to a close, I should stress that none of this is new, and the defamation of the British public is not new. In his reflections on the revolution in France, Edmund Burke mentions the radical pamphleteer and advocate of the rights of man, Dr. Richard Price, and he mentions Dr. Price's passing reference to the dregs of the people who are generally paid for their votes. The dregs of the people. And Burke says, you will smile here at the consistency of those Democrats who, when they are not on their guard, treat the humbler part of the community with the utmost contempt. So nothing has changed very much, but we in Britain have reasserted perhaps the most important thing of all in our sovereignty, and done so, it seems to me, and this is again worth noting, in the most reasonable and decent manner possible. We haven't had a yellow vest-like movement. There have been no riots. There have been no mass burnings of cars and civil disobedience. We were asked our opinion in a vote, and we gave it. And for the first time in modern European history, that vote was counted as meaning something. Let me finish by saying one other thing. In The Art of Poetry, Horace says that it's not enough for poems to be fine, they must charm. And Burke somewhere picks up on that and says, there ought to be a system of manners in every nation which a well-formed mind would be disposed to relish. To make us love our country ought to be lovely. For Burke, this loveliness centered on two things in particular, on the spirit of the gentleman and the spirit of religion. We could be here all day very happily listing the things that should and can make a country beautiful. Let me just, though, reiterate a few which are relevant to our discussions today. One of the things that makes a country most beautiful is a genuinely free press. Free from government interference and free from hostile individuals who want to manipulate public opinion. Another thing that makes a country beautiful is a free university and education system which is both free from the malign pressures of government and free from malign pressures from without. A genuinely beautiful country is indeed open to the world, but it is not borderless, because it cannot be, because such a country becomes chaos. It will be tolerant, but not endlessly tolerant. It will not be tolerant, for instance, to the extent that it encourages and pays for those who do not tolerate us. And it would, perhaps I should stress again, and perhaps remembering Roger Scruton in particular, a beautiful country will be a beautiful country with a beautiful built environment, a place that allows people, whatever their economic origins, to live in beautiful places and have an opportunity to aspire to the timelessness that those buildings can suggest. I, at any rate, am concerned about the future of Europe. I'm concerned that this correction that we're going through does not, in the years ahead, become an overcorrection. But with that one caveat aside, perhaps I can just say, in this most beautiful of European cities, a final thank you to you. Thank you.
We say, and I ask you to say with us, lift up your voices in this great meeting in the heart of England, and to all the world a message: England lives and marches on.